Hello and welcome to the Ask the Industry Podcast, episode 122. I'm comedian Simon Caine, and for those of you new to the show, this is the podcast where I interview the most influential people from the worlds of stand-up, comedy, radio, and today, screenwriting and script editing. Jeremy Dyson is an English author, musician, and screenwriter who, along with Mark Gatiss, Steve Pemberton, and Reece Shearsmith, are the League of Gentlemen. I got him on to talk about how Ghost Stories was created, his horror film and play that he wrote with his childhood friend Andy Nyman, as well as all the knockbacks, setbacks and rejections that went through to get to where it is today, as well as the future of that and the new project that he's working on, which is really exciting. I nearly said what it was. You'll hear about it in there. He alludes to it a bit better than I would, and I don't want to ruin it for him. So there's that. Also how he picked his agent, what he was doing to make ends meet when he was doing the first series of The League. All of these things. Outstanding episode. I really loved it. If I'm honest with you, it's one of my top 10 episodes of the podcast ever. I would highly recommend this to anyone because script writing and editing is such an important thing in all areas of comedy, except maybe improv, that it's just got so much in it. So I really recommend it, and well done you for picking this episode. If you are new here, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. If you're old here, please do remember to give us an honest, ideally positive review in iTunes. And either way, please do join the Facebook group. It's called Ask the Industry Podcast, and it's on Facebook, obviously. But for now, let's listen to the Ask the Industry Podcast with Jeremy Dyson.
So as to whether I knew I was going to end up writing or was aiming at being a writer when I was young, as a child I never thought of myself as a writer, but I did have a fascination with production and making film and TV, from almost as soon as I was watching it. And partly fueled probably by Doctor Who. There were two editions of a book called The Making of Doctor Who, both of which I got bought. One was about 7 and then the other one must have come out when I was about 10. That lit a fire, along with I had a real interest in special effects. And I got another book bought one Christmas called Movie Magic by John Brosnan. So the first thing I thought I was going to do was be a special effects man. That's what I wanted to do, was make models of spaceships, basically. But then not long after that, I developed a proper love of comedy. Growing up in the 70s, there was a load of great TV comedy on, and because it was just on 3 channels, paradoxically, rather than the infinite amount that's out there now, it was much easier to navigate and access because it was all, to use a modern word, curated for you. From just watching stuff with my parents and sitting down and enjoying Morecambe and Wise, and then discovering that I like Benny Hill more than anybody else. And then from there, leaping to the goodies, and then Monty Python would have been a first passion when I was about 11. That really lit a fire. Python I discovered through the ancillary stuff, because I was too young to watch it when it went out, but through the LPs, the films. And I had a comedy friend at school, Steve Cook, and we shared the passion. And we used to, from being about 11 or 12, we started improving our own comedy onto tape cassettes. So I was doing that all through my teenage years with Steve. And I also had a Super 8 camera. I was very fortunate to have attentive and encouraging parents who kind of knew what I loved and fed it. And that made a massive difference. So I made little stop motion animation films on Super 8. And it was all quite haphazard. I was very undisciplined as a kid. So whereas I look at my own kids now, who are both remarkably disciplined and have rigour, partly because they're girls, I think, I didn't have that. That's an awfully sexist thing to say. I just realised. But I think actually girls are, when they're kids, loosely speaking, maybe more diligent than boys. Or at least mine are, anyway. So yes, that was where I was coming from, but none of that I would call writing, and the writing came much later. So I went to art college with a view to going to sort of do some kind of filmmaking course, of which there were less in those days. This was mid-80s. So I did a foundation course with a view to, there was a course in Manchester, a film undergraduate course, and there was one in Nottingham, which was a fine art course, which had a filmmaking leaning. So that's why I was doing the foundation course. And while I started writing, I think it was for one of my final projects. It was 2 things. I had another love, which was ghost stories, supernatural fiction, starting with all the stuff I'd read as a kid. I loved ghost stories as a kid and read loads of classic anthologies. And then in my teenage years, I was read widely with science fiction and discovered Stephen King, who was having his first flourish then, and sort of gobbled him up. And then via Stephen King, I came across Ramsey Campbell, who King had rhapsodised about in his book Dance Macabre. Ramsey's an English author, still with us, brilliant writer. King had gone on about one story in particular called The Collection. Not The Collection, The Collector. So, and I had to track this, and it was hard to track Ramsey's stuff down, or at least it was for me, because there weren't many bookshops then, and there were no big bookshops like Waterstones. And I found, in Smith's, I found a collection of his short stories, and that lit a fire again, like Python did. And I read that and thought, well, this is what I want to do. And the next day, after devouring his collection, I sat down and started writing my own version of a Ramsey story. And from there on in, I was doing that. I was writing through copying Ramsey. I kind of found my own voice. Other writers fed into that process as well later, namely Robert Aikman's another one who I started copying. So that's when that was just as I was finishing art college. Yeah, and I'd also written sort of journal stuff that was part of my final project, and people had read it and said, "Oh, you should write more. You can write really well." So that was a discovery that I had a sort of vocation to write stories, and that I had an ability or a facility that I hadn't really been aware of. Then I got a place to do fine art on the filmmaking course in Nottingham, and I didn't take it. Because the main reason being, or at least I told myself, I also was really into music, and I was playing in a band in Leeds called Flowers for Agatha. I was playing keyboards, and we were enjoying some success. We'd got a record deal with a local label. We'd had airplay, Radio 1 airplay, and so if I'd have gone to Nottingham, I would have had to give up the band, and it was too painful because it felt like something was going to happen, and I couldn't do it. I just couldn't muster leaving the band. So as a compromise, I took a year out to work out what to do, and then I did a philosophy degree at Leeds University, which was a compromise because it wasn't as much fun as doing the creative thing that I knew I would have loved, but it allowed me to appease my parents, be on a university degree course and still play in the band. Of course, the band then split up about a year into the course, and I was left doing a philosophy degree, which for the first 2 years didn't really click with me at all. But then in the third year, it did, when you could specialise and pick your subjects, and I chose philosophy of literature, and I did a course on metaphor, which was really terrific. And there was another really brilliant course called History of Ideas that was taught by a great teacher there called John Christie, professor. That was kind of following big ideas through literature, sort of starting with Frankenstein and then working through. He was a big science fiction fan, John, so loads of great science fiction that I'd never read with big ideas and really looking at it quite rigorously. And that really, and that's sort of, again, lit a third fire, which is still with me now. That kind of deep thinking about narrative and story that is a bit of an obsession. So then I graduated and was way off from where I thought I would be or what I wanted to be, which was in some way in making stuff. But the one thing that had happened is I'd met at Leeds University, I'd been introduced to, in fact it was just before I started, in my year out, I'd been introduced to, no it wasn't, it was my first year, Mark Gatiss. That was through our mutual friend Gordon Anderson, who I'd been at school with. And Gordon about the time I discovered I loved writing, Gordon had discovered a facility for drama that he never knew he had. And he went to Bretton Hall to do drama. And that's where he met Mark. And almost within his first week there, he'd met Mark and he'd rung me and said, "You've got to meet this guy. He's just like you." And I hated that because I hated being pigeonholed so easily. So I sort of resisted, but he wouldn't let up. And that Christmas, he kind of organised a get-together at his house where I had to meet Mark. And of course, we clicked straight away. Gordon was absolutely right. And then we kept seeing each other while he was at Bretton, and then it was at the tail end of him being at Bretton that we started writing together. We wrote a comedy script for fun, and that was the first time, apart from doing my stuff with Steve at school, where I'd sat down with someone else to do some comedy who shared the same tastes, and we were literally just doing it to entertain each other. It wasn't with any kind of view to send it out or anything. And then I left Leeds as Mark was graduating. Mark stayed in Leeds, and I went to get a job in London, and I really didn't want to go. I wanted to stay with Mark because I sort of knew I wanted to do something with him without knowing what it was. But then I went and did this job in London, which was working in film distribution, which was really miserable for me because it was on the periphery of the thing I wanted to be at the heart of. And I had a miserable time, and I got really ill, and I ended up coming back to Leeds. But I'd also applied to do an MA in script writing, finally kind of thinking, right, I've got to get my act together and do this properly. And there was a course that had just started up in Leeds at the Northern Film School. It was established by a visionary guy called Richard Woolley, who'd had this idea of setting up a film school to rival the London film schools, because there were so few places then that would do that. And he had a really clever idea where that, I guess it was copying what they did in London, but maybe not, where would have a writing course and a directing course, and the two one would support the other, and the writers would write short films, the directors would make them. But as I remember it then, the directing course was in Sheffield and the writing course was in Leeds, and they had to go back and forth. But anyway, so I got a place in the second year. In its second year of running, maybe its second or third year, and it was a great course. It was a really good year. It was one of the most enjoyable years that I'd had, along with the foundation course. And I discovered it was more confirmation that I had people telling me that I could write, and that was a massive thing to have, to discover that I could do it and I could do it well, that, because none of this had been picked up on at school or anywhere else, so it was kind of new, it was a discovery, and it was a surprise actually to discover that this seemed to be my thing, writing, because I thought it would have been making. Now of course I've come back round on a big loop, and I now make as well, and that, in fact, that journey back to making started when the League went onto TV, and you could predate it to actually when we were doing the live shows, because I was in a crude way, because I was opping the shows, I was doing the sound and the lights, sat at the back from the get-go, or apart from the very first show when I was in it. So it was a long and windy route, and I had to discover all these things before I could, sort of start being me.
Was it frustrating? Because you said you don't like to be pigeonholed, and yet people were saying, "Oh, write more." If that wasn't sort of the path you necessarily were picking for yourself, or thinking would be your way, was it frustrating having people kind of?
Oh no, because it was coming from deep within me, so it wasn't. I wasn't being told what to do. It was the opposite. I was definitely choosing it. I was just deeply surprised by it, and because it wasn't what I'd anticipated, and that I find fascinating. That you sort of discover yourself, but it was latent, but I hadn't intuited. I'd intuited a bit of it, which was the making part, but I hadn't the other part of it. No, it didn't bother me. I mean, if anything, I pushed the making bit away, actually. Once I'd got onto the script writing MA, I definitely wholeheartedly embraced the script writing bit of it 100%, and sort of forgot about the making bit temporarily. So you could, if that was 92, 93, I was doing the writing course. Then we started doing what became the League mid-94, putting the shows on. And then when we were doing the first series on telly, which was 98, we were making it, mid-98 onwards, and I was on set, I suddenly remembered, oh, that's what I wanted to do. It was like I'd forgotten and remembered, of course. And then I was really fortunate in that our first producer, Sarah Smith, I got on really well with, and she was very supportive to me, because she recognised I was in an odd position, or unusual position, because the other three were on camera. And she said, well, come on as a trainee AP, assistant producer. That was still the tail end of the BBC having those kind of organised schemes for training people up on in-house productions. So I went in as a trainee assistant producer on the first series, and and learnt the practice of the theory that I'd vaguely knew, just from reading. But that's not, there's no substitute for. And then the other piece of luck was I got on really well with Steve Bendlack, our terrific, wonderful director, and he was just perfectly happy to have me sat next to him all the time when on set, which I did, and so just watched him work and absorbed the process. Best way of learning, it was. And then because I was and then second series I became assistant producer full, and so was given some responsibility in terms of sitting in mixes and dubs and what have you, and and so you just begin that ramp up to voluntarily taking on more and more responsibility and learning that way.
Yeah, totally. And that hands-on thing, I feel, is slightly harder to do now at the BBC. I feel like less opportunities being given.
Yeah, they don't have that. There's no formal structure for that anymore, as far as I know, because they've lost their in-house production arm for a start. So.
Well, they've got their commercial BBC studios, like
but the days of those those schemes where they would train directors up, which was still running when we were going in. It was the tail end of it, but they were still there. That's gone, as far as I know.
Yeah, no. I had an interview with them, and it's become BBC Studios, which doesn't do that same thing.
No, and basically they have to function basically like any other large independent producer. So
yeah, which is a total shame. And
yeah, when you look at what came out of the BBC and who came out of that, John Schlesinger and Ridley Scott, and they trained up a whole Mike Leigh would have come out of that, and anyway, those were different times.
Yeah, totally. And when you first started writing together, and you were sort of just doing it for fun, and you were saying that you were influenced by a lot of like writers that you've been reading and that had kind of not maybe come into your brain consciously, but sort of that osmosis of consuming so much of someone else's work, it obviously is going to have an impact on what you were doing. Were you conscious of that when you were writing together? And did that ever manifest itself as any level of like imposter syndrome of like, oh, I have to write like someone that I know and I'm not going to learn my voice? Or was it always kind of, I'm just going to go with the process and see where it goes?
Yeah, it was. We never suffered from imposter syndrome. We were so arrogant. We were so full of ourselves. So we maybe arrogance is unfair, but we were confident. We were very confident, and I think one of the extraordinary things was that we shared all these odd little reference points. So so for instance, one of the things that me and Mark bonded over was Robert Aikman. Mark knew Aikman and loved him just like I did. So we had met all these references that were outside of comedy. I mean, we had the obvious comedy references with Python and everything that came with that. And followed from that, but then sort of beyond that, we shared what was then more eclectic taste, like Alan Bennett, which was a rare, it was rarer thing to sort of know and be familiar with Bennett. Then, at least it was mid-80s, and when we first met, it was pre-Talking Heads. Victoria Wood, obviously, early Mike Leigh comedies like Abigail's Party and Nuts in May were sort of seminal for us. So these were things that you'd cherished on your own and never really had anyone else to talk about to them, and suddenly you had three new friends who knew all those reference points, all the same almost identical mix of things, and also the horror stuff as well. We all loved Theatre of Blood. We all loved these things that we'd found on late night horror screenings on BBC Two, when we were in our teenage years or younger. So they were part of the mix. And so because there was this weird synchronicity between these what you felt were very private passions up until that point, that was like rocket fuel, I think, to our creativity. And the other thing, of course, is that they were unbelievably gifted. I mean, as performers, I was sort of staggered by how good they were, and they would that was how they were when I first met them. But as writers, equally, I can remember quite often going around to Stephen Reese's flat where they were living together in Highgate, and and they'd read out what they'd written that week, and it was I couldn't believe how good it was. It was as good as anything that you'd ever seen, and that was a clear-sighted thing. It wasn't. You wished that wasn't the case, because you were kind of floored by how good they were, and how could you compete with that? But then, of course, it had the great effect which is what a good collaboration can do. You had to raise your game to stay in the game. So it was like you'd try and not outdo, but try and match. And so you had to work. You really had to You really had to work. You couldn't just toss off anything because it wouldn't have made the grade. We were very sensitive to each other as a group in terms of no one rode roughshod over anyone else, and we came up with all kinds of mechanisms for voting, sort of, anonymous votes on what material was going to go in the Edinburgh shows and things like that. But it was still quite a rigorous process in terms of only selecting the stuff that was, that really worked well. There was no appeasing of anyone's better feelings,
Yeah, it was kind of like put your egos aside in some ways.
Absolutely, yeah, and I sort of appreciated that. It was tough, it was, but at the same time, I really respected that was sort of unquestionably built into how we were going to do it.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because it sounds like up until that point, a lot of the feedback you were getting was very positive from outsider people who maybe, I don't want to say their opinions didn't matter as much, but I imagine that the free of their opinion would have been more valuable to you than, say, just someone else who's read a thing you've done and, said it's good. So I'm just wondering whether all of a sudden getting constructive feedback from people you clearly want to work with and think are better than you, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth there, but I think...
No, but that's right. You were kind of, I was kind of in awe of their ability, and so that's absolutely the case. I just had enormous respect for them from the get-go, and wanted to work with them because it was the most exciting thing. And it was everything you'd ever dreamed of. It's everything from the comedy side of me. It was everything I dreamed of from, when I was 11 and had first come across Python. It was like, because I did, that's what you wanted. I was constantly, as a huge admirer and fan of that, I was for everything because I'd missed Python's birth, because I was too young for it and was enjoying their afterlife. As a fan, I was then looking for, well, what's the next thing and what's going to be the thing that can be my Python. And sort of not like 9 o'clock news came along, and which was great, but that didn't quite fit the bill. It didn't sort of have the thing about Python was they were a gang. They weren't put together. Well, of course they were slightly put together by a producer, but they became a gang. And then then it was the Young Ones, and the Young Ones was probably, in the comic strip and that crew, but the Young Ones was probably the closest thing to, yes, this is my Python at the time, because they felt more like a gang. And then it was Vic and Bob. There was other stuff that you were enjoying along the way, but then Vic and Bob was a thing that you could own. And so that was the thing that you wanted, was to do something like that. And then suddenly I found myself in this position. Well, I didn't find myself, I actively pursued it with great vigour. That I was, you felt you're on the cusp of being able to do this thing that you've been dreaming about.
If we take it back slightly, and we go with, so we're talking 92, you said? This was 1992?
Well, me and Mark started writing together in earnest in, say, 92, I would say. In terms of we wrote a script and sent it out. 92, 93. It was a spoof sitcom. It was a bit like Austin Powers, actually. It was the idea of 3 60s superheroes who'd been frozen in the revolving restaurant of the Post Office Tower and revived in the present day. It was the same conceit as Austin Powers, but pre-Austin Powers. And we wrote that as our half-hour script, and we sent it out and got mostly rejection and maybe the odd tiny flicker of interest.
How old were you at that point? Sorry, just...
So 26.
And so that was your first finished script at 26?
I'd done... Well, it depends if you count the first half hour that we wrote, which was called Bedlam, which was a sort of spoof of every Perry and Croft sitcom rolled into one, but set in a lunatic asylum. That would have been sort of 1989 that we wrote that, but yeah, we didn't send that out. And then I did write stuff on my MA course, and I wrote a feature script on the MA course, which was, what you did. That was your final project. But yes, it was the first stuff that I'd sent out. Yeah, I was 26.
Okay, and well, 2 questions out of that. One, what were you doing were you working at the time? Do you have like a part-time job? Yeah,
I was working part-time at Waterstones, which I did through my MA. Carried on doing that in the early days of the league. So I was working I was in Waterstones in Leeds, and then I transferred to London once we started doing it in earnest. I had to move back to London because it was obvious. It was just obvious. There wasn't a second of doubt that that was what I should be doing. So we all had part-time jobs or signed on, or a combination of both.
Yeah, and so you've gone through this sort of discovery of knowing that people say that your work's great. You've met this group of people who you really want to work with. You're really enjoying it. You think their work's great. You love your work, but you're sending stuff out, and the initial reaction from industry, as we would put it, was negative.
Yeah, apart from, as I say, the odd flicker of interest. But yeah, essentially, nobody was biting our hand off. It was mainly rejections. In fact, one of the things I cherish is a rejection from Armando, which when he must have been reading scripts at one of the production companies. I can't remember who it was from, but yes, that's a common experience.
Yeah, no, very few people get stuff immediately. I'm just wondering what it was like to go from, oh, okay, everyone's saying this is great, it's great.
Oh, no, there was no surprise in it. No, there was no surprise in it at all. It was what you'd expect. You didn't expect, you hoped, but you didn't expect. And, there was, and in fact, I don't think you could do it unless you had a slightly masochistic taste for rejection and the attendance. Well, I'll show you, you almost need it.
Yeah, totally. And so you then started taking up shows with the other three to Edinburgh?
So we'd all been working together in various combinations, but not as a group. Me and Mark had written these scripts. Mark had written with Steve. They'd done a couple of one-act plays. Stephen Rees had done a couple of one-act plays that they'd either had rehearsed readings or put on. And Steve had started a theatre company with Gordon, the old friend that introduced me and Mark together in the first place, called 606. They were a really terrific little theatre company, and they put on... Gordon had a knack for finding really odd, forgotten plays and putting them on at sort of little pub theatres, interesting little pub, venues around London. So what happened was it was Gordon that kept saying you should all be working together. You should pool your resources as a group and work together. He'd been asked to remount one of his shows at the end of '94 in a little festival at the old Cockpit Theatre in Edgware. He couldn't get the cast back together, so he said, "Look, I've got this slot. Put on. Why don't you? This is the thing I've been saying. Come and put a show on. Put your show on here." I think we'd already been talking about it because I remember going to look at some other venues. But anyway, that was the galvanising thing. It was something definite. So we wrote a show and we put it on, and I was in it then.
There were no previews. You just did it one out of the gate.
Yeah, we did. I think we did 4 nights or 5 nights. But yes, we just did it. And it was, it was clear from the get-go. Well, 2 things were clear. One, it was the 3 of them, and I was at best a talented amateur, but I didn't have the drive or wish or passion for acting. I kind of liked the idea of being on stage and people clapping, but in terms of creatively, that wasn't my passion. And I didn't have their phenomenal ability either. And so it was quite easy to say, right, I'm going to stick to writing. That's my place in this. It's the 3 of you going forward, because it was so obvious. But the material was really good. You knew it was a good show because the audience laughed, and it really worked as a show. There wasn't a second of doubt about carrying on doing it. So then the challenge was, well, how do we do it? Didn't have a promoter. We were just supporting it ourselves. We sort of had a year of trying to get on the stand-up circuit, which was, sketch shows were so unfashionable at that point in the mid-90s. It was like seen as old-fashioned, and we sort of, as a fuck you, we doubly embraced that by putting on dinner jackets to do the show, as if we were some old Footlights show. The irony being we weren't anything of the kind. And it didn't work on the stand-up circuit. It was deadly, because you'd go on after a stand-up and drop a 4th wall down to do the sketch, and it would just die. So that wasn't going to work. So Steve, who had the idea, I think, of, look, let's do our own night. With vague memories of reading about the Establishment Club and things like that. So Steve had a relationship at the Canal Cafe Theatre from 606. So he said, let's just book like every Monday night for 3 months, and we'll make it our night, and we'll just change the material regularly to try and make we could populate it. It was only a tiny little theatre, 50-60 seater, so you could populate it with people you knew between the 4 of us at first, and then if we kept changing the material, they might come back and see it more than once, which is where the continuing narratives were born, because it was character comedy from the get-go. Quite quickly we worked out that was what interested us, was character comedy, and these grotesques.
Can I just check? Sorry, so the night
Yeah.
was just you guys performing for an hour?
Yeah, for an hour. Yeah, and we paid for it. We put the money in to hire the place, and we covered our costs, and we made a small enough profit to then we saved all the money. Steve was very good in terms of the business side of it, and we saved the money any profit that we made, and it all went into a kitty. We did 2 runs, as I seem to remember. I think we did a sort of early part of the year one and then spring one, and it meant by the summer we had about 6 hours of material that had been tested in front of an audience. We took the best hour of it up to Edinburgh. We just did a best of, basically. We were doing it ourselves. It was our money. I think Mark knew somebody who was just starting out as a promoter, in a sort of very small way, and he gave us a helping hand, I think, with the printing the flyers and stuff and getting posters done. And Mark also had a contact who knew the guy who ran the Pleasance. That was that was a big deal. Pleasance was one of the key venues in Edinburgh, comedy venues. And this guy came and saw one of the London shows at the Canal Cafe, and he said great, and booked us into a tiny little attic venue. But we were still taking ourselves up at our own expense, and we didn't know anyone up there, and nobody knew us. We just...
So I was going to say, were there any other sketch groups doing stuff? Did you meet others? Or was it like, we're still the outliers of...
There were other sketch groups. Armstrong and Miller were up there. I think it was their second year. Matt and David were up there. That was their second year. And we met them all when we were there and quickly bonded. The Cheese Shop were doing it. That was Dave Lamb and his colleagues. So, there were other sketch groups, but they were generally still thought of as being old hat and passé.
So at this point, have you got an agent? Have you got representation?
So, we had a proper fairy tale 3 weeks. We took ourselves up. First 2 shows, we had 3 men and a dog in. And then on that third show, we got a 5-star review in The Scotsman, I think. Suddenly the next show was full, and because it was a tiny venue, it was like a 70-seater or something, it was quite easy to sell out. And once you were sold out you go on the sold out board at the front of the venue, and it just feeds on itself. Plus we were picking up more and more good reviews across that first week, and it was a strong show. It was a really strong show. It had material that ended up in the TV show. So by the end of it, we had our choice of agents, unbelievably. We had offers from 5 or 6 different agents, and the BBC interested. In fact, the BBC more than interested, because we got we're ready to sign us on what was then called a bi-media deal, where you would do a radio series first and go on to do it on television, which was a terrific thing. It was great to kind of try it out on TV and then, on the radio, or not try it out, but to do a version on the radio and then take stock and, build it as you went onto TV.
Well, before we move forward from there, in terms of Edinburgh and in terms of reviews, was it you had PR, or you emailed reviewers and you asked them to come see you? Like, how did you get the first reviewer in, I suppose? Or was it...
They just wandered in.
It's just blind luck.
I think Mark, maybe we did have a bit of help with PR. Again, it was Mark. Mark was a brilliant networker, still is. And I think it was Bridget... I can't remember her surname, but she helped us with the PR. She certainly helped us the second. She must have been helping us the first year, so maybe she did help get people in. But it was all quite informal and friendly. It wasn't. It was doing us a favour as much as us paying her lots of money, because we didn't have lots of money. She liked the show, and wanted to help out. So yes, that must have been the case. But it definitely had its own momentum.
Okay, so let's talk about agents really quickly. So I think you said you had 5 offers?
Yeah, we met 4 or 5 agents, yeah.
Okay, and they wanted to represent you individually or as a group?
As a group.
Okay, and as obviously that's the dream for a lot of performers, and something that is very much unheard of these days. You might get 1, 2, at most be interested. So I suppose at that stage, were these agents... Because I know you're with PBJ? Yeah. So what were they like at that point? Because obviously right now, when you look at PBJ, they're so much more established than they might have been when you originally worked with them.
No, they were pretty established then, because you just looked at the client list and it was all your heroes. You couldn't believe the client list. It was Barry Humphries, Vic and Bob, Chris Morris, Armando, Harry Enfield. Yeah, okay. Where do we sign?
So how did you decide? So I mean, there's obvious reasons why you would go with them, but did you? What was the discussion? Was it you're working for us, we're working for you, we work together?
We were deeply impressed by Chiggy. You know, she was just hugely impressive. It was such a good meeting in terms of. I mean, they were all great, the agents. It was like you would have been happy to go with any one of them, but I think you had to make a decision. And Chiggy, I remember the one thing Chiggy did differently is the other agents had all told us what they were going to do for us. And Chiggy said, right, I'm going to start by telling you what I'm not going to do for you. And she did went through a list of what she wasn't going to do for us. And that impressed us.
What was on the list of things
I can't remember.
Okay.
I can't remember. I just remember that's how she started it. It was like the exact opposite of everybody else, and there was something very impressive about that.
Okay, and in terms of when she first took you on, because it sounds like a dream situation for her as well, given that you've got a BBC interest, technically without an agent. So she's there now to kind of facilitate contracts and sort out all the paperwork.
Yeah, and also I think she had a relationship with Sarah Smith, who was the producer who'd first found us, or at least was the producer who came in, and then John Plowman was over Sarah at the BBC. He was the exec, and I think he had a relationship with PBJ, so that helped. I mean that I don't know whether that was invoked in the meeting or not, but it all flowed.
So for me, whenever I've watched The League, it feels so visual as a medium. I can only imagine how, maybe not frustrating, but a challenge it must have been to take it from live, where, and I'll be honest with you, I've never seen it live, where it must be such an atmospheric and an immersive thing to kind of, like you say, break the fourth wall and to bring in these characters to life in a way that, comedy doesn't always do. To move that to radio, where you can't actually even physically see sort of what's going on. How was the process of, I assume you were very much involved in the script editing of that. What was it like trying to build worlds in people's heads who maybe hadn't had a chance to see it in Edinburgh, maybe didn't see it at the Canal Cafe, weren't aware of what you were doing?
Well, we embraced it. We embraced every stage of it. Although, we were 100%, knowing we wanted a TV show. We embraced, none of the stages to the TV show felt like a poor relation to it.
Can I ask, is that why you went to Edinburgh? You originally went there to try and get a TV show?
No, we went there to get noticed. But the thing was, they because the three of them were very theatrical naturally, and had been at drama school for 3 years and loved theatre. Doing the theatre version of it wasn't a compromise. That in itself, was a pleasure. And there's it's certainly true that some of those sketches, their best incarnations were those original shows at the Canal Cafe, because it was like proper theatre of cruelty. It was like the impact of doing some of those sketches in a tiny room when the audience is that far from you, and you're drinking a pint of piss and throwing it all over the front row, and or Ross is being whacked in the face with a clipboard by Pauline, and it looks real. That was its perfect version in lots of ways. And it also that we loved the discipline of that we hit upon quite quickly, that you were allowed one prop or item of clothing per character, and that really forced us to write character. You had to create the character in the dialogue and in the action, because you weren't putting prosthetics on.
Was that just due to how much space you had to?
Yeah, you had the Canal Cafe. There was a tiny little cupboard off in one wing. There was no backstage, so everything had to go in a basket. And likewise, Edinburgh. So the show had to be portable. And then when it came to doing the radio version, again, it was exciting because you were recording in the radio theatre. And we were all such comedy fans. You go in the radio theatre and you just think the Goons, and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and all these radio things that we did. John Shuttleworth, who was on at the time, that we adored. Not that was done in the radio theatre, but we didn't. Radio comedy was still a brilliant thing, and it was. Don't forget, we were just fanboys, pinching ourselves. We couldn't believe that we were in that position, that we suddenly were doing a radio show. So all it was unbelievably exciting. There was no sense of frustration or, I can't wait, I wish we were doing visuals. We were struggling to catch our breath that we were doing this.
Did it ever feel a bit like, I don't want to say unjustified, but did it ever feel like sort of, oh my god, they're going to find us out. They're gonna realise that they've picked the wrong group because.
No, again, I refer you to my earlier answer of disgraceful self-confidence. We couldn't have been more confident about what we were doing. We were just, there wasn't a shred of doubt about. There was a shred of doubt that we might not get picked up or it might not work out. But I do remember, and Rhys often quotes it, that in one of our early shows that we did at Brighton, which was probably pre-Edinburgh, so us, me and him sat on the beach having a conversation where I said, look, the only thing that can stop this happening is us, because we could all see how good it was. Because you could see, you just trusted your own judgment of what it was, which didn't mean that every thing that we did was brilliant. Some sketches were good and others weren't, but the enterprise, you could see how good it was or how good it could be. And I could see how terrific they were as performers and as writers. So that was your fuel, and you just knew as long as you kept going and kept faith in it, you would get there, because you just would. You couldn't doubt it. But, what you didn't know was how long you had to keep that faith, because it might have been 10 years.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a good thing that you all had each other to ground yourselves, but within the group as well, there was still this belief, Well, we had each other to ground ourselves and also to motivate each other. So, and it was a dance between, being rigorous and strict enough that you're keeping the quality control up, and and then motivating each other when you got knockbacks, because we did have knockbacks along the way. It wasn't just a rise. We haven't really talked about the knockbacks, but we had disappointments and things before we signed with PBJ. How long after sort of that Edinburgh did you still have part-time jobs?
I still had mine while we were recording the radio series, and then I took the plunge and gave it up at the start of '98. So the radio series had finished, and we were then going into doing our pilot. Although the series was sort of commissioned, it wasn't quite greenlit. It was sort of greenlit in theory. And actually, we found out afterwards that it was a real struggle, but they kept it from us. But it was John Plowman that kept, he just wouldn't take no for an answer, and pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed until it was green lit. But they sort of kept that from us a bit. So as far as I was concerned, we were doing our TV series that year, and so it felt appropriate to give up the job, and it was scary.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, like, what did it feel like the first morning after you've sort of finished your last shift to be like, oh, what do I? Yeah,
exactly that. You felt like you'd jumped out of a plane with no parachute. I mean, I could have always gone back. I could have always, if it had got desperate, I could have gone back and but I didn't want to do that, and so it was scary and it was tough. First year, 18 months was tough. Living on no money and not knowing when more money was going to come, and the obvious.
Was there a moment with the radio show, or maybe even with the first, or even just any of those seasons when you were making the TV show, where you started to think maybe this is going to be a thing, this is going to have a following? Like, was there any I don't know, a fan coming up to you, or I don't think, this isn't when social media would have been around, so you wouldn't have, sort of had that.
No, so we had good reviews, and we'd had good reviews from sort of Edinburgh onwards, and we'd had press, but we didn't have any sense of fans. And when it was on the radio, we didn't have any sense of fans, because there wasn't much time for it to establish itself. And so my first inkling was, after the first series had gone out, I was moving flats from where I was in Arsenal to up the road in Highbury. The removal men came. I'd hired a couple of men with a van. They saw some. They might have seen the Perrier Award. We had Perrier Awards on the wall, or something. They saw something and said League of Gentlemen on it, and they didn't make the connection that I had anything to do with it. They must have thought it was like a bit of merchandise or something. And I said, "Oh, I love that show." And I couldn't resist but say that that I was one of the writers, and you don't give a fuck, do you? That's one way he drinks his own piss. You don't give a fuck. And that was exciting. That was like a badge length to where then that somebody, a man in who works as a removal man has seen it and knows it, and that felt like something. But then the real marker wasn't until when we did the first tour, which was after the second series had gone out, which was and then the second series went out at the start of 2000. We did the tour in the autumn, and and we put it on sale, and then McIntyre's had done it as a sort of fairly standard comedy tour, and then we got an inkling that it was selling, because I think it was extending from the 6 weeks or whatever it had started out as. But then it was the first night that was the watermark. So I stood in the foyer with Paul Roberts, who's our promoter at Phil McIntyre's, and we stood there watching these people come in, Bristol Colston Hall, so a big venue, and Paul said, "Who are these people?" He said, "But you can't pin them down." He said, "It's not students, it's it's not just young people, it's who are they?" And it was such a mix. It was like, there were older people, there were families, there were students, but it was such a kind of strange absolute cross section, like you got random cross section of society, and the thing they had in common is they loved this show. And then obviously the show, then you knew when the show began, and Mark Stephen Rees came out onto stage, the huge roar, and it was like, oh, and that was when you knew. So we were quite a way into it.
Yeah. The difference now, I suppose, is with social media, you get instant reactions from after shows, and if you were to do more, that would come back. So how has social media impacted maybe how you write for things, or did you think about that when you were doing the latest tour?
No, we kept it from our heads, because we learnt that on our various other enterprises to be disciplined about not paying too much attention. So fortunately, it wasn't around for our formative years, because I think it would have been poison, or you'd had to acquire a lot of discipline very quickly. And so we're a bit older now, and perhaps a little bit more shielded from the temptations of. I'm not saying we don't look, but it's not a point on the compass, I don't think.
But it sounds like pre this, you were either reading reviews or being told that you'd...
Oh, yeah, we always read our reviews.
Yeah. So is it a case of, like, you've got to a stage now where you kind of don't read reviews, or you don't...
No, I'm terrible. I wish I did. Mark's much better at not reading reviews. Mark doesn't really read them. But I'm terrible. I look at them all.
You got Google alerts and things.
I haven't got Google alerts, but I will Google.
Okay, fair enough. And you've won quite a lot of awards for TV, and I just wondered what awards made a difference to your other projects, and like what maybe helped you along to maybe get other things made, or at least for people to take other scripts or other work that you were doing outside of the league more seriously.
I don't know if any individual award did that. I mean, the one that they said the one that would do it was the BAFTA, and the thing is, it's more about an aggregate of everything, I think, in terms of whatever reputation you have. So the awards are just part of that, and you learn quite quickly to have a healthy skepticism towards awards. Because certainly once you sit on an awards panel, which we've all done, and you see what the process is, you sort of. It helps puncture the mystique a bit in terms of it being an absolute judgment of one's ability. So obviously it's important because it's part of a bigger picture, and they're lovely and wonderful things if you win them, because of the excitement and being in the game, and so it's not to denigrate them in any way, but having a clear-sighted understanding of what they are is helpful, I think. So yeah, I wouldn't. The one I would say that was actually the biggest deal on a personal and emotional level was the Perrier Award, because that was the first one, and that was a massive life-changing moment in terms of what it felt like. Not necessarily in terms of how it translated into material happenings, but just in terms of what it felt like.
Yeah, like even now, that award, I mean, it's not called the Perrier anymore, but that award is very much like shining a light on a performer so much that it can't help but feel, probably, I've never had it, so I don't know, but it probably feels so humbling to go, oh my God, someone's noticed.
Yeah, exactly that. and and it felt like it changed everything.
And you obviously work as a script editor and you for other people. And how was that process of starting to edit other people's scripts outside of sort of your, I wouldn't say bubble, but like this group that you've kind of worked with for so long? How did you kind of gain someone's trust to start working on their...
Well, it never occurred to me to do it. It wasn't something, I got asked. So I think the first thing I got asked was, properly that I can remember, was Mark Wootton to do... he was doing Shirley Ghostman, and he was wanting to develop that into a different kind of show, and so that would have been my first paying gig as a script editor, I think. And I loved Mark, and I thought he was wonderful, so that was why I did it. It wasn't because I wanted to be a script editor; it was because I wanted to be in the room with Mark, I think. So that was the first one, and then not long after that, I got approached about doing Armstrong and Miller, and I'd loved Ben and Xander up at Edinburgh when we first gone up, and thought they were brilliant as performers, and I'd loved their Channel 4 series. So again, it was as much about, it would be great to work with them as it would be to, right, I'm going to pursue a side profession as a script editor. And then it just sort of flowed from that. And then after doing Armstrong and Miller, Ben Cavey, I got to know Ben Cavey at Tiger, and he was a generous and lovely man, and he asked if I'd do Grandma's House and if I'd read the script, and the same thing. I just loved Simon Amstell. I was an enormous admirer of him, so it was always driven by who the people were, rather than I must get a next job as a script editor. It was on that, and I think pretty much everything I've done has been because I want to sit in a room with whoever the people are. So and again, I pinch myself at the people I got to sit in the room with. That I still get to sit in the room with, from Kathy Burke and Matt Bainton and James Corden on Wrong Mans, and Sharon Horgan on Dead Boss, and it's like, I can't believe I get to sit with that. I've got to sit with those people and work on their shows, and it goes on, and what's lovely now, of course, is working with younger people. I'm like doing Bad Education with Jack Whitehall. It was amazing because he's telling you about watching your show when he was 12, and which was also terrifying. But and then meeting Freddie and Jack's writing partner on Bad Education, and Freddie's brilliant, and I love how it all unfolds in a sort of organic way. Always trying to follow enthusiasms, being led by an enthusiasm for the material.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you pick projects, but it sounds like a lot of the projects, A, for you, like you said, come to you organically, and B, it wasn't really, you didn't need to pick. You were like, what they want me kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you often get? Is it a case of your agent kind of self-selecting because they're like, oh, I know he likes these people, I'll give him this option, or is it a case of you sometimes do get things where you're like, I don't think we would gel, or I don't think we would work well? Like, how does that work?
If I read a script or watch a taster and it doesn't gel, then I wouldn't do it. No, if I felt like I didn't have anything to offer the program, there's got to be some enthusiasm there for it. But to be honest, I can't really think of things I've said no to. I've said no to things because I'm too busy. But I'm not really. A lot of the approaches tend to be direct or semi-informal as well. You either sort of bump into someone or the producer. It's a small world, so everybody knows everybody. So the producers will often email you directly and send you a script or whatever. So particularly with younger people, so like I'm doing Hitmen at the moment, and I knew Joe and Joe as by reputation from Gumball, because I love Gumball, and the animated show on Cartoon Network, Adventures of Gumball, and they were writers on that, and so I was kind of honoured to be to be asked to work with them because I admire that show. So,
as someone who's seen a lot of scripts, are there common mistakes that you see, or like pitfalls that people often fall into that you would sort of advise new writers to kind of look out for in their own work?
You're always wrestling with versions of the same thing often. In narrative things, it's often variations of the same issue about story, clear through lines for your main character. Main characters going passive is almost a universal on early drafts. And then it's individual things. In terms of things for young. The one advice, the most important advice to give anyone who's starting out is to, if you're writing and that's your thing, is to write. Just write script after script after script and make sure you finish them. Don't half finish things. And each time you write a script and finish it, you'll learn something more about whatever. There's no wasted work. And, I think that's in my own work because, for everything that you do that gets made, there's several things that don't get made. So, but you never feel that the work is wasted on it because you've learned something new from writing that script.
Do you have any tricks or hints for getting yourself through a block? So say you're writing a script or you're developing a character and you sort of just can't get past, I don't know, like a midway point or if it's like a sitcom pilot, if you just working your way through it. Have you got any tricks or hints for getting yourself?
Well, number one is the sooner you can commit to making your living as a writer, that's a brilliant cure for writer's block. It's the best cure I know. Because it's not an option then. If you literally you have to write scripts and complete scripts in order to eat, or earn an income, that takes care of itself because you just have to do it. So, that sounds a bit facetious, but there's truth to it, I think. And I've read that advice also. I think there's a really good book called The War of Art. What's the author's name? I can't remember. It's Robert something. He's a novelist. Proper. He wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance. It's a really good book about the creative process of being a writer, and that's one of his things. Is as soon as you can get into the position where it's your living, because it just creates a mindset that, and obviously there's a challenge in that because it's tough. It's a very competitive business and it can take time to get to that point. It obviously took me from the decision to I want to write to making a living at it. It was nearly a decade. So and I'm sure that's quite common. Have
you when you as you become more established in the industry, have you found it's easier to get things made?
No, it's not easy to get anything made. No, and the old adage about you're only as good as last thing you did is on one level deeply true. And obviously there are periods when it'll go like that, and there's periods where there's more heat on you because you've had a success or done something noticeable, and then it's perhaps easier to get people to read stuff. But I don't think anything gets made easily. And you speak to so many people, writers who I won't name because that wouldn't be fair, but who you would not believe the conversations I've had with them from their reputations in terms of the difficult times they've had with script after script not being made or struggling to write work that they felt was good. Or it's a tough business.
Have you ever had a script or had an idea that you were just so sure needed to be made that you ever got tempted to make it and put it on YouTube or try and make it yourself?
Not quite that route, but to some extent. I mean, Ghost Stories was a bit like that. The play. I mean, not quite because we got the commission from the lyric, but it was a sense of let's do something and let's do it ourselves. And there was a real excitement in it.
Well, looking at the way that you originally developed the League, it feels like you and Andy were kind of doing it in the same vein, where you had a deadline. Did you? Because I've heard an interview before where you said you had a deadline. You kind of just had to have something written by that point, because otherwise there was nothing going to be on it. And then it kind of just progressed from there and went forward. So it feels like you've got your method of making something and seeing the instant reaction from an audience.
I do love that process, and what's great about doing it that way and in theatre on a relatively small scale in the first instance is it's just you and it, and there's no layer of executives or politics or any of that. That was the wonderfully refreshing thing about doing Ghost Stories, because I'd had a couple of years of various projects that had got quite close and then not happened, and the deep frustration that, and then it was such a joy, and a kind of revivifying joy to think, oh, we can just do this, and we don't have to. We're not waiting for anyone's permission. We just put it on, and it's just us. It's just us and it and the audience, and that's great.
Did you think of Ghost Stories when once it had been complete and you were like, well, this has got wheels, it's got legs? Did you think this could be a film, or did someone approach you and say we should make this into a film? Like what was?
No, we always, from when with the first week of writing it, when we sort of hit upon the overall shape of it, it felt like there was something cinematic about it. But we did make a conscious decision to park that thought whilst we focused on, getting it as good as we could get it in its theatrical life. And then we had various approaches when it first transferred into the West End, because obviously there was heat on it, and so you do get those approaches. And there was a sort of big studio approach that came from America, and which was very tempting, but we wouldn't have been able to make it because they would have just basically probably let us do a draft, and that would have been it, and then they would have owned it. Unfortunately, that didn't work out for a number of reasons, and we had some other approaches. And ultimately, we sort of got to the point after a couple of years of that, of realising if there was going to be a film of it, we wanted to do it the same way as we'd done the play, and it was us doing it for good or ill, because it was so personal to us, and we felt such a strong connection to it. So we waited till the rights reverted to us, which they did after a certain period of time after its West End production, and then we wrote a spec script and went on that journey.
Was there any part, because I've seen the live and I've seen the film, and I know the plot itself hasn't sort of changed massively between the two, but were there any elements of the first script that they said, we just, for either budget reasons or whatever, they're just like, we wouldn't make that, or we couldn't do that?
No, not once we'd written the script. No. That first draft that we sent to Warp, there wasn't much that we couldn't do. I think because in our heads we knew what scale we had to make it if we were going to be able to finance it. So I think we'd avoided putting anything too grand.
I suppose I have a similar question for the League. Like when you look back on it now, were there any things that the BBC either wouldn't let you do or said we couldn't do, or even would you think wouldn't get made now?
Well, the whole show wouldn't get made now.
As in because of...
They don't make shows like that now. Yeah, it's too expensive.
Not because it's, I don't know, like there's something in it, that political correctness or...
No, because, if we were young now, we'd be tailoring it for the society that we were in as young people. And they still make edgy comedy now. No, it's more about that sketch shows are very expensive to make, and there was still all the machinery and infrastructure of in-house production that made it easier to make a show like that then, and but it's gone now because obviously there's the television landscape has changed so much, and the kind of shows that get made now, that at least by the traditional terrestrial channels are different. So
we are about halfway through the podcast and I am loving it. It took me and Jeremy about a year and a half to sync our schedules, and I'm over the moon. This one's in the can. Honestly, I knew it was going to be a good episode. I just had a gut feeling about it, and I adored talking to him. It was another one where we kind of lost track of time, which is always a great sign for an episode, and I am over the moon. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you're getting as much out of it as me. While I have you for a second, I just want to say that at the time of recording, the League of Gentlemen Live is back on the iPlayer. So if you wanted to go and watch that after the episode, obviously wait after the episode, you can do that. If you're not from the UK, so you can't really get iPlayer, or you don't have a VPN, then you can watch Ghost Stories, his horror film, or the League's TV series on Netflix, which is super exciting, and we get into talking about Netflix and deals. We get into how things are bought internationally after this advert break. So without any further delays, here's your advert. Welcome back. What a lovely advert that was. I'm very happy that that product and or service is paying to allow this episode to stay free. I'd just like to take a minute to tell you that I am doing the Edinburgh Festival with my 4th solo show entitled Every Room Becomes a Panic Room When You Overthink Enough. It's at the Sweet Venues, it's in the Grass Market, it's at 8:35 every single day, except Wednesdays when I get rudely awoken by the dustman. There's a link in the show notes, tickets are £5. If you can come, please do. I would appreciate all support. Seriously, anything and everything is really appreciated, so if you can't make it, please do bring a friend, send a friend, all of that jazz. That'd be amazing. And now, let's jump back into the podcast with Jeremy Dyson. I remember hearing an interview with Andy where he was talking about his thoughts on fame and how he was saying that you kind of have to put that to one side and not, think of that as, that might be something that comes, but not have it as like your main thing that you should be aiming for. And obviously all of you have got different levels of sort of notoriety with different areas. I mean, is there are you sort of comfortable with like where you are in terms of being known in a wider sense, or have you ever sort of thought it would be nice and maybe easier to get stuff seen or read if I was better known? Because obviously when you have a name attached to something, it tends to push things along a little easier.
No, I don't really have those kind of thoughts. I'm the opposite. I'm kind of immensely grateful for whatever position and reputation I have attached to my name, and and people are when I work with them. So no, I'm the opposite. I pinch myself on a regular basis.
And just sort of moving back to social media for a sec, are there any social media channels that you particularly like and maybe look for new talent on, or you try and discover people that you might want to work with?
No, I don't. That doesn't figure for me. I'm still it's word of mouth, more general word of mouth of people I know recommending things, or that would lead me to somebody, I guess, rather than. I don't pay too much attention to social media. I'm not a fan. I'm on Twitter, and I do it. Obviously there's value in it in terms of when you're promoting stuff, but I try and keep it at arm's length.
And in terms of online TV, because a lot of the shows you maybe script edit go on like Netflix or online players and things like that, and people watch those on their phone on a train or whatever that like on a computer where they're just physically nearer like sort of the action, if you like. Does that change how you edit stuff? Because the sort of collective viewing experience isn't really. You know what I mean? It's all changed so much.
Yeah, we do. Funnily enough, we did have those conversations in the edit in Ghost Stories. We were most mindful of it being watched on a cinema screen, but then we did every so often remind ourselves that that it would have an afterlife where more people would watch it on a laptop or an iPad or even a phone, and so you just have to remind yourself, go into that mode occasionally of because there's the thing that we got from a Walter Murch book where when he was editing, he would always cut out little heads, like silhouettes of people in cinema seats, and stick them on the monitor to sort of give him that reminder that this is to be projected on a big screen. But you've also got to then do the opposite of that, and then take the cutout of the heads away, and put a big iPhone there, and remember that that's also how people are going to watch it.
So did you physically do that? Did you put them on the?
I think we might have done at one point. Whether it was for a joke or not, I don't know. But it's useful. It's very wise advice because you're looking at a monitor, and it's quite easy for it to devolve into television and forget that it's going to be projected theatrically. But I think ultimately, on some level, I've been watching telly for so long and watching movies for so long. I started watching stuff on my own on a portable black and white 12-inch screen in my parents' bedroom. So, I watched many films, many widescreen CinemaScope films would have been terribly panned and scanned, and watched on a little black and white screen. So I've got no nostalgia for how things used to be, or I think we're in a golden age, because even if you're watching on an iPhone it's got such a high resolution and the crispness of the image that it pisses all over VHS, which is how most stuff I grew up watching. Would have been. So I think. In terms of what's clear and visible, your relationship to that screen, if the phone's down here, is pretty similar to if you're sat, halfway in the stalls in the view.
Yeah, totally. And you don't live in London anymore. You live out in Yorkshire, and
yeah, I've lived in Yorkshire for 12 years now.
Yeah, and I wondered whether that, when you first moved away, was a big decision, because obviously the industry is so London-centric, and obviously, well, I don't know where the other three live, but when you were all living down here, or you are working down here, it must have felt so much like, you know, you were moving. Did you ever feel like you were just leaving the industry? Do you feel like you had enough reputation to do that?
It was another scary leap in the dark. It was a bit like giving up the job at Waterstones. It was a sense of, well, we'll do it and see what happens, with absolutely no idea of what it was going to be like, you know, on every level, because I professionally, all my income pretty much had been coming from the league, and we were stopping doing the league, and I had a young family, and but it was just following an instinct, really. And it was well, we'll do it, and we can always move back if it doesn't work, and you know, which would have been easier said than done, but nevertheless, that was the spirit that we went and did it. And then, you know, what I've found is I can't think of one day when it's been a problem. It's very easy to get down up and down to London via Leeds. It's almost a commute. You know, it's a 2 and a bit hour train journey, and once you've factored in the cost, obviously train travel is expensive. But, you know, that's a choice to live up here. It's kind of swings and roundabouts, because it's also cheaper to live up here than it is in London. Once you factor that in, it's very doable. And, of course, we've had the following wind of technology and information technology. So, you know, because of doing this, you know, so me and Andy, because Andy lives in London, we Skype, write Skype, we're using Writer Duet all the time, and have been doing for about 4 or 5 years. And when we were editing Ghost Stories, it was brilliant. I was there 3 days a week and here 2 days a week, and I had the feed from the Avid on an iPad, and I was Skyping on my computer, and it was wonderful, you know, to not have to, you know, to have the freedom to do that, and to be able to mix and match and not be sat in the edit suite even though I was there every day. I didn't physically have to be there every day, so.
But is there a part of that makes you disconnected from the process?
Yeah, I'll always be in the room with for that, you know, or at least when we're doing initial sessions. Yes, and I like to mix it up. Most of the time I am in the room, but it's different when you're writing with, you know, a collaborator who you've been working with for many, many years, and you know each other very well. So.
Well, at what stage do you like to start, like, join a project? Do you sort of like to have the script finished and you can just edit it from there, or like they've got a spec script and they're not sure whether it's going to go to series? Like, when's your favourite time?
I don't mind, because I like the journey of, you know, if you're with a script that's at a very early stage, and you know you help get it across the line, or you contributed to that process, that's very pleasing and satisfying. But equally, it's fun to come on board something like Hitmen. This is a case in point where they had 6 drafts already of all the 6 episodes. So, you know, you're coming in quite late, and that's nice as well. So they're both pleasurable, yeah. And I do quite a bit of, as well, you know, mentoring if I get the opportunity of you know, of young people starting out. If the approach comes in a certain way, I'll and that. Or sometimes that comes through other organisations, or you're working with people who are just beginning, and that I enjoy very much as well.
How does the mentoring work? As in, like, they come up to stay with you for a week or something, or you come?
No, it would be the same thing where you would do. You can get a little goes a long way. You know, you would do a day in a room, or you know, maybe 2 days.
I've noticed that you get listed a lot either as a script editor or a script supervisor, and I wondered if you could say in practical terms what the difference of those two things are.
And that must be the vagaries of each individual production. The job's always the same.
Okay, it's basically giving your feedback on the script, but without kind of changing the narrative too much, or making sure it's still...
It depends on the thing, because sometimes you'll go in and it'll be, you know, there'll be quite a bit of reworking, and sometimes it's closer to a polish, and it depends on the job, and you know, at what stage they're at when they come to you, and what they're looking for as well.
And if we can quickly talk about, like, the return of the league, if you like, the most recent live show, how was that as a was it a case of you've always kind of wanted to go back to it, or like someone approached you and said, we think there's a tour here, and like, did you ever worry that maybe the audience might not want to come and see it again? Like,
oh yeah. Yeah, we completely worried about that. Or not worried about it, but we didn't know. I mean, you know, in terms of doing the TV specials, that was something we'd been in the air for a few years, because we were missing each other, And we kept having dinners and saying, shall we do something? But of course, everybody was so busy with their individual projects that it was a sort of semi-pipe dream. And then it just so happened that there was a sort of window in the middle of last year, a year before, 2016, and everybody was coming off something, and it was like, oh, should we do it now? Because otherwise we'll never do it. And fortunately, the BBC wanted it, and so they didn't mess around, and they sort of struck while the iron was hot, and so it all happened quite quickly. We wrote it quite quickly, and it was made quite quickly, and so it was in the gap between finishing Ghost Stories and Ghost Stories coming out. We went from nothing with the League to writing it, making it being broadcast, in a period of 6 months. So that was great. And then, once we'd come back together, we thought, well, it would make sense to do a tour now, because we always enjoyed it. It was so much fun to do those tours. And so we just, and the promoter had been in touch and said, well, if you want to do it, we're very happy to do it. So there was no great pressure. It was well, let's put it on sale and see. But we didn't know.
Had you all been writing stuff, or like?
No, we just sort of made the commitment to do it, and then with the knowledge that we would then write the show.
Okay. No, I just wondered whether you'd ever when you left the League, if you like, or finished.
Oh no, we hadn't thought about that. Was the lovely thing. You literally hadn't thought about it from a creative point of view for 12 years or whatever it was. And the last thing we did was end of 2005, which was the last live show, and we picked up again 2016, wasn't it? So it was 2017. So it was 12 years. Yeah, and the lovely thing was, because of that, as I've said elsewhere, it was like turning on a tap. It just poured out because it had been sat there in our collective unconscious, and because you'd been away from the characters for that length of time, but we knew them all very well, it was just an absolute delight to sit there. Well, what's Les done now? What's happened at the Dentons? And just work your way through them.
And when you're between projects and things, or even like when you are on a project, are you always writing other ideas as well, or are you so in a project that you kind of don't want to sort of split your focus?
No, I've got about 6 things going on at any one time, so which is quite usual, I would have thought, for someone in my position.
As in 6 scripts that you're always working on, or?
Yeah, I'm on average between 4 and 6 scripts at various stages of, because I've started on doing episodes of other people's shows as well, which I really enjoy. So I've just done a Killing Eve, second series of Killing Eve, done an episode of that, and I'm just doing an episode of a show called The Irregulars for Netflix, and I'm enjoying that, doing it as a kind of new thing.
Would you write them for spec, or would you just be writing them for fun, as in I've done a series of Killing Eve, I've got this idea for a show, I might just write it and see if they want it if there's a series 3. How would?
Oh no, those were approaches. No, they weren't. I didn't go in speculative. They approached me.
Do you still do speculative stuff at all?
Yes, but my own projects.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask what's sort of next for you. I think I heard that Ghost Stories is coming back to London, but I presume that's going to be Andy and you're not obviously in that. So.
Yeah, well, it's not Andy, it's a new cast.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, so that's it's a new production. So that's going on at the Lyric at the end of March. That's where it began, at the Lyric, and in Hammersmith. Me and Andy are in the midst of writing a film script as a follow up to Ghost Stories, not a sequel, but another film for us to hopefully do. And then I've got various film scripts of my own that are in various stages of drafts. I've got a series, various series that are various stages of development at different broadcasters. So it's quite a full plate at the moment.
Let's say you've got six plates spinning. Is it a case of you more want to go with the one that you have the most energy for and you are most creatively fulfilled by, or is it a case of you sometimes have to park that and go with the one that someone's commissioning and saying we'll pay you to do? How do you balance those things?
Well, you have to be very pragmatic, but at the same time I really try and focus as exclusively as I can on doing things that I have maximum enthusiasm for. So I tried not to take on anything that I don't have maximum enthusiasm for, and And obviously, if it's something that I'm developing myself from scratch, then that's built into it. But if it's a show that someone else has approached me about, I would have to feel that kind of enthusiasm towards that show to want to take it on, because otherwise I don't think it would work out very well. So I actually put quite a lot of energy into thinking about what work to do, and trying to think ahead and look ahead, and you've got all the challenge. Anyone who does this, who makes their living as a freelance writer, effectively, there's a challenge built into that in terms of cash flow and all of running a business and all of that. And it's definitely, but it's a great game. So I kind of like that side of it almost as much as the writing, the kind of the strategy of it, of running the business, as it were. And I do, and yes, a lot of thought goes into what am I going to do. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so how far ahead do you have to plan for yourself? Like, because obviously there's time that it's going to take to make so that even if a script gets picked up, it might be a year before it even comes out or even starts in production. So how far ahead do you have to think?
Well, in terms of, there's a difference between things being made and scripts being commissioned, if they are commissions. Well, you're sort of looking 9 months to a year ahead in terms of having work. I would start to feel uncomfortable if I if I didn't have sort of 9 months to a year's worth of work in front of me. But in terms of things being made, of course, you've no idea what's going to get made. All you know is only a fraction of what you're working on will get made. You just don't know which fraction.
And are there any sort of like projects that you're working on at the moment that you're like speculatively or even been asked to make that you're thinking, okay, well, that's going to be the 9 month down the line thing that I've got to work on? Like, how's that working for you?
Well, again, you have to be very adaptable and flexible because decisions can come. If you get a green light, it can sometimes come unexpectedly and quite quickly. So, Psycho Bitch is a show I did a few years ago with Tiger for Sky. That was like that, where we did a pilot episode, and then almost straight away they said, right, we want 6, and because I was directing it as well, I had to clear the decks unexpectedly for that, because obviously it was a joyful thing to do, so I wanted to do it. So yeah, you have to be prepared to do that, but there's an understanding within the industry that everybody knows that if you get a green light, that you have to go. So if whatever else you're working on will, and most working writers will have a version of that, and you understand that if that happens, why that's happened.
Putting words in your mouth, very much your job is 50% show, 50% business, if you like.
Oh yeah. I mean, it might be 60-40, and it might fluctuate more one way than the other. I mean, it's probably 60 in terms of hours spent or more attention. You are most of the time you are writing or creating or what have you, but it's always on your mind, and so it's part of every day. And I've definitely refined my process of how to do it over the past 12 years of doing it. Because it took care of itself during the years of the league to some extent. So it was learning how to do it began for me post-league.
Yeah, and did having sort of an agent mediate that anxiety?
Well, an agent doesn't really get you work. You have to get you work. An agent does your deals for you. I suppose equally if you went to your agent and said, "Oh, I need some work," they would be helpful in putting the feelers out, I'm sure, but unfortunately that's far not how it's been for me. So it doesn't. It's more about you do it yourself. I like to self-start on things.
Are there any skills that you wish you had, either from members of the league or just other people that you've met, that you're working towards, and how are you doing that?
I'm always trying to refine my skills as a writer, so that's something I do quite consciously and sort of study and read and do online. There's so much great online teaching material as well now. So I like the masterclass website's brilliant, and fantastic things on it. So I really like doing that, and Andy likes doing that as well. So we often share and swap things. And likewise with the directing, obviously that's newer, and same thing. Lots of sort of studying and reading and watching films and talking about them with Andy and doing quite a bit of proper sort of studying work on that side of it, which I love. and then you're always sort of soaking stuff up from everybody you work with, so that's what I do, like trying to say yes to things. So if someone asks me to do something, my starting point is always yes, and then unless something comes up that makes me say no. And I found from doing that, so much has flowed, and sometimes you'll do a job, and even though the job hasn't gone the way you wanted, you'll take one bit of knowledge away that's just gold dust, that then you feed off for years to come, that you wouldn't have got if you hadn't done the job. So doing is key, and being active and stretching, always being slightly, your reach slightly exceeding your grasp. I think that's really important, not getting comfortable, not repeating yourself, trying to develop what skills you have, and just keep reaching and stretching out. So I wasn't a natural. I had to learn long form script writing because I was using. I'd learned writing sketches and albeit longer narrative sketches that ran over series, but then having to take on feature script or hour-long scripts or whatever, that was a new thing to learn how to do. So,
what do you think's the biggest mistake you've ever made, and how did you overcome it?
Self-doubt. When I was younger, doubting my abilities and being not daring to do the thing that I've done, and then along the way, little versions of that. Sort of thinking the negative self-talk. You talked about imposter syndrome earlier, which didn't apply for the league, but that's much harder to deal with when you're on your own. So it does, those demons do gnaw at you when you're working on your own, as any writer or any creative. Anybody who does anything creative will have that. And I think a big part of one's career and doing it as your living is learning to wrestle those angel stroke demons, and everybody has their own version of them. And me and Mark and Andy are forever swapping stories about people. I can't tell the stories, but it's amazing. You will find that everywhere. From people who practice at the highest possible level. It's a universal.
Who do you think's the most underrated person in the industry, either in front of or behind the camera?
I can think of films or individual programs and things that might be underrated. I'm not sure about individuals because it's a small industry. People talk, and the goodwill out. So, public esteem might be a different thing, but in terms of industry, I wouldn't. There's no one person that springs to mind of an underrated talent.
What do you think is the biggest problem in the industry, and how would you solve it?
Playing safe, commissioners and broadcasters not taking enough risks generally, and that's a constant. It was ever thus, and you understand why that is. But I think we're in a great time at the moment because the streaming services have really shaken things up, and they're remarkably bold with their commissioning. Partly because they seem to have Netflix seems to have a bottomless pit of money, but they've really bold, wonderful programs. And hopefully that will have a trickle down effect, in terms of broadcasters here seeing the rewards of being courageous and commissioning things that are original. Because generally, broadcasters love original, groundbreaking things after they've been successful, but they tend to be very nervous about them in advance because they don't look like they will be by definition. They look too weird or strange or different, and everybody knows that, but it's very hard to put into practice.
They want to be the one that discovered it, but they don't want to be the one to take the risk on it.
Yeah, they won't. It's not a conscious thing. It's just kind of built into the process of doing it because it's very expensive to make television, and the stakes are always high, and it's always going to be easier to go for a thing that feels like it's going to be successful. But the often the things that we cherish the most don't look and feel like that.
Last question: what bit of advice have you most cherished over your career?
It's not quite advice. The principle is perhaps there of when me and Andy went to speak to Sean Holmes, who was running the Lyric at the time, about Ghost Stories, the play. He programmed it without it being written. He had faith in us. He had such faith in us that we would deliver it that he put it in the program without seeing a script, and that's so much the opposite of every other aspect of the industry that it was like getting a shot of it was like a defibrillator in terms of reviving my own creative spirit. have to see that act of faith from somebody else in us. So there's not much. That's not much useful to anybody else. But suffice to say that those things come in your career, and when they do, they don't happen often, but when they do, they are to be cherished and savoured, and you can get a lot from them then, which you then take forward.
Well, thank you very much for taking part.
That's great. Thanks, Simon.
That was Jeremy. I love that pod, but it is not over yet. Jeremy and I carried on emailing for maybe a week or two after we'd done this episode, and then it kind of just went blank for a week, and then out of the blue he emailed me, and the email said, and I quote, "Can I come back on? There are loads of stories about failure and the power of your attitude and luck in this industry that I'd love to talk about." Now, not wanting to miss out on some absolute gold, I said sure. What follows is the final bit of the podcast. This was originally a Patreon exclusive, and I decided to put it back in this episode so that everyone could enjoy it. I thought a lot of people would get a lot out of it. I personally adore this story and this message that he has about your attitude and about the way that you deal with rejection. I think it really sums up a lot of things that got my head on straight about certain things going into Edinburgh. And I figured a lot of other people are going into Edinburgh, and there's going to be a lot of failures, and there's going to be a lot of disappointments, but there's also going to be a lot of opportunities to keep your attitude in a positive mental state for the Fringe. So I thought it's definitely worth including. If you would like to become a patron and get this sort of content exclusively ahead of time before anyone else, and sometimes it will only be Patreon exclusive, so you will get everything that I make in relation to this podcast, at least, from $1 an episode. Please do click the link in the show notes and join our ever-growing list of patrons who support the podcast and keep it going. Just want to give a quick shout out to all of our current patrons. Here are the people that are keeping this podcast going and keeping the lights on at my house: Simon Warner, Mike Sheldon, Janice Havies, Nick Wilde, Chris O'Leary, Dave Natris, Paul Robinson, Dara Fitzpatrick, Ben Jennings, Michael Mooch, John Paul Stevenson, and Banksy Banks. Those legends are the people that are keeping the lights on. You can join them. Please do, from $1. I'd massively appreciate it. I highly recommend you zone in for this next bit, because I think it's easily one of my favourite stories and nuggets of wisdom that I've ever put out on a podcast. Thanks for listening. Let's jump back in. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll reread it to myself, just because this is always a weird one for me. Is that whenever I'm doing an interview with someone, I tend to listen to a lot of their previous interviews, a lot of their previous podcasts, just so that I know, like what they've said before, questions that I would ask, leading off from those things. So I try not to just make, another episode of something else they've already done. And this, obviously, every time a guest comes back on and we talk about stuff, is very much them knowing what's going to happen and me sort of going, well, okay, I'll probably have something to ask in a minute. But you obviously, so you were talking about, we were chatting back and forth on email, and you were saying you want to talk more about the importance of failure.
Yeah.
How that's dealt with, and the best advice. Hang on, did you write the best advice you've ever been given, or the best advice you've?
It was failure, and it was a thing about the Charlie Higson story is twofold. It's about courage, and it's also about encouragement. It's kind of it's both from both perspectives of receiving and giving.
Let's go. So where do you want to start first?
Well, so another thing that I wanted to talk about briefly was the importance of failure. Because failure is so bound up in any creative process, and it's very, very easy to just think failure equals bad, and obviously on an emotional level, that's how you feel every time something gets rejected, or something doesn't get green lit, or but you get a bad set of notes or whatever. It's obviously bound up in the process, because it wouldn't be possible to do it otherwise. And yet, it's taken me a long time to realise this, but I really kind of came to a visceral realisation last year when we were promoting Ghost Stories. It was me and Andy talking about it together, that not only is failure a necessity, it's actually a hugely valuable, hugely positive thing. Because it provides so many opportunities. And how we came to realise this was on Ghost Stories. If I tell this story, I think it illustrates the point. So, to get the film greenlit, we had to go through many processes as is usual, from, scripts, revised scripts, attaching cast, all of those things. And, we started off developing it with one film producers with Film 4 via Warp, and then we parted ways with Film 4, and that was kind of feels like failure number one. Then we went to the BFI, and the BFI paid for us to do a taster, essentially, to shoot a reel. And partly I think because we were first time feature directors, and partly because there were two of us, and it was to answer questions about how we would work and whether we were up to it. And so we shot that reel, and then basically they watched the reel and decided that they didn't want to carry on with it. Again, a not uncommon occurrence. And of course, that was absolutely devastating at that point for me and Andy, because we'd been developing the film for 2 years, from when we started writing the spec script and all the points we'd got to up until then. And Warp, I think, was struggling at that point. They were slightly running out of steam with, well, really, where else can we go with it? So it really felt like proper failure. It felt like, there was certainly a few days where it felt that was it, and that was going to be the end of the idea of Ghost Stories, the film. And then me and Andy, we were on the phone. There was a few things that happened. One was me and Andy sort of talking to each other and sort of like just unable to accept that it could end there. And then, sort of from out of the blue, I got a call from my brother, who's not in the industry at all. He works in finance. I mean, in banking. But he was asking how it was going, and I told him what had happened, and he just happened to say that he'd started going to this investment club, like a sort of Dragon's Den thing, almost for fun. That's how different he is to me. And and someone there was involved in film financing, or had been in the past, and would he like to set up a meeting with him and with Warp, and so in absence of anything else, well, why not? There was absolutely nothing to lose. And so we went along to this meeting. My brother came, and Andy and Robin came from Warp, and what was really interesting was although we didn't tangibly end up doing anything with that guy, it just sort of unlocked the next stage, because this guy was an outside eye on the whole process, and he was sort of able to sort of summarise where we were, which was, look, you've got this property which has been successful in the West End and internationally. You've got an international star attached, because we did have Martin attached at that point. Why can't you get this financed? And just to have someone else say that seemed to just be enough to lift the whole thing again. And it shifted Warp's perception in terms of where else they could go, and that was the beginning of how we ended up with Lionsgate as our producing partners and distributors. And then, but the crucial thing was also out of that was me and Andy resolved, right, we rolled up our sleeves and we said, right, we're going to learn, we're going to take full responsibility for this. We're going to accept that although we were sort of happy with the taster tape, the taster reel that we shot, obviously something didn't work, because the BFI didn't want to make it after seeing it. They were looking for an answer, and they got an answer which was a negative. So something didn't work there, even though that wasn't our feeling at the time. So we're going to be hugely forensic. We're going to look at what we feel didn't work in that reel and about how we went about it, and we're going to look at the script again. and be hugely forensic with the script, and like what could we do differently. And I can remember thinking, it was the first time I thought, look, I have this other life as a script editor. I'm going to go through the script with my script editor's hat on, which is a hard thing to do with your own work. But nevertheless, I'm going to do that as an exercise and see what happens. And so all of those things together, we really shifted some stuff in the script. We were able to find things that we could see, looking at it that way, could be improved. And the big thing was that we looked at the taster reel again, and the crucial thing is we hadn't really landed a key scare in it that the thing ended on. And in our heart of hearts, when we looked at it in the face, we knew that. We knew we'd slightly muffed it. It ended on a sort of jump scare, but it fell between two stools, and it didn't really work as a moment. And there are all kinds of reasons why that was the case. You could rationalise it. We didn't have any money, we didn't have any prep time. It was you had to shoot it really quickly, but nevertheless, you could see that it didn't work. So what we did then was we modelled every single scare that was written into the script, and we found a model for it in some of our favourite other movies, so that when we went, so it was like a technical thing, so that when we went into to shoot each of those scares, when we finally got greenlit and made the movie, we'd been really rigorous about, okay, we know that if we do this and this, these will at least work technically, because it's quite a technical business to get that reaction from a jump scare. And so this was the thing me and Andy realised, was you could quite easily imagine a world where the BFI, had they been feeling more benevolent or wanted to give us the benefit of the doubt or whatever, thought that, well, okay, it's okay, that test reel, they'll probably rise up to the challenge, let's go ahead and green light it. There's certainly, you can hypothesize a world in which that happened rather than them passing on it. If that had been the case, we wouldn't have done any of that work. We'd have shot the draft of the script that we had. We would have been, on cloud nine, thinking we were the bee's knees, and we would not have done that extra hard, pass on the script. And it was from the humiliation of the thing, having the pain of the humiliation of them passing, that we did that really ultra forensic work on both on the script and on how those scares were going to land, which meant that the film was stronger than had we shot the BFI version of it. And so me and Andy realised, as we were talking about, well, God, that's because we failed. If we hadn't failed, we wouldn't have, none of that would have happened, and who knows? But you can certainly imagine a world where you would have made a weaker film.
Well, I was going to say, you if you hadn't have failed, you would have made the film because the failure was being told they wouldn't make it.
Yes.
So the film was going to get made. If the film had got made, would you? I mean, it's a hypothetical thing, but based on where the script went and the developments in how you, and I don't want to say it like this, but I'm going to say it like this, and you can rephrase it if you want.
Yeah.
How you took the structure, or you took the elements from other films you liked to improve your own. Would you have said the film wouldn't have been as good if they had just...
Yeah, because human nature being what it is, you don't do unnecessary work. Or it takes a lot to motivate you to do unnecessary work. Always easier to believe you're great. and the temptations to believe that are always there,
I'd say the most interesting thing for me about this is, and I had a discussion with a friend a couple of days ago about this exact thing, is whose opinion do you take on board? Because as we talked about in the original pod, everyone's got an opinion on Twitter when you put something out on the internet, or I'm sure when Ghost Stories went live on Netflix, you got a load of tweets from people that loved it, maybe people that hated it. There would have been more feedback there than you could probably even deal with. So this person who your brother happened to meet, who happened to do film finance in some capacity, I assume from what you said they worked at Lionsgate.
Oh no, it wasn't. That's the thing. There was no actual connection between them and what actually happened. I think they did put an offer in, but several other companies did as well. So we didn't end up going with them. But it was just that experience that just was enough to lift the thing back onto the rails, of having someone, with me and with Warp sat there. It was just enough we were so despondent to sort of kick us up out of our despondency of like, come on, get your act together, pick yourself up and get on with it. Because it's a choice. It's a choice to stop.
Mm. Yeah, and as you said, I think we spoke about before, as you said, you don't ever give up on a project, you just shelf it.
Yeah, and I as anyone, any working writer will know, and not just writers, producers, directors, whoever, the story of things that get made, 9 times out of 10, it's been a 10-year struggle or equivalent to get it made. I'm doing an episode of Tom Bidwell's show, The Irregulars, at the moment. Sorry, you'll have to edit out that ping, sorry. And it was 13 years from when he first started developing that to, I'm sure he won't mind me sharing with you. And that's not uncommon. And particularly in the world of film,
What I find is you also mentioned that having Martin Freeman attached to it helped in terms of that. If the film, and this is just a technical question from someone who's never made a film and never done something like that, but if you don't have a contract to make the film, or you don't have a budget or anything like that, how is he involved? Like, is it a case of he's basically said, I will do it if I'm free and if it's got budget?
It's a thing. There's a thing. It's called a letter of intent or something like that. So it's an all things being equal, I will do this film. So it's not contractually binding, but there is a letter, and it's more than just a kind of wish or an aspiration. It's somebody saying that if this film gets greenlit and I am available and you can make it work, I will do it. Yeah, and that's quite common, I think, in terms of movies in that situation of what will happen.
Were there any other stories or points that you wanted?
Well, so that was the failure one, and obviously that story is almost archetypal, because I could then point to many other things, be it individual sketches in the league or other moments in one's career that really followed that pattern. But I just think it's really good thing to know that one must embrace failure and almost, if it doesn't sound masochistic, hope for it. There's another thing I do remember, when we'd written the script for the League film for Apocalypse, and we sent it to various people to read, and there was some very well known and very well respected comedy person that sent it back and said it's wonderful. And that was the most useless set of notes that you'd ever received.
Yeah.
Of course, it was brilliant at the time. You were delighted to have someone tell you that. But after the event, you realised there was no utility in being told that it was wonderful.
But I think this leans back into what you said before. You said that there's a I'm trying to quote back you to you, and I'm going to do it badly because I haven't listened to the episode for a while. So let's. It was something like you said. There's something great about working with someone because they can actively tell you, like you said, it's really hard to edit your own stuff.
That's right. Yeah, you've got the editing. The editing is built in if you're collaborating. Yeah,
exactly. And I was talking to someone. It was the same conversation the other day with this other comedian where I said, I don't like failing, but I do love failing. And they didn't understand what I was saying. And basically what I was saying is, about 3 out of every 4 projects I start, I end up failing, but I learn something from it. And I always shelf it and I come back to it. But they were like, but surely that was just a big waste of time. And I was like, it can't be if I learn from it. Like, it doesn't...
That's right. And I've read this advice from so many places, but you have to live it before you internalise it. But there was one it was, leading Hollywood screenwriter, and he said, he does everything on spec. He's got to that position where he can do that. And his process is he writes a draft and he puts it away for a year. And he doesn't look at it for a year, because by leaving it for a year, he's able to see it with such fresh eyes when he reads back that it just makes editing it so much easier, because stuff falls away rather than if you're going back to it after 2 or 3 weeks. And you think, God, what a wonderful thing to be able to work like that. I would say, and I was, that's the other thing I was reflecting as well, was when I very first started writing, when I don't think we talked about it, but my first thing was really writing short stories. We did talk about it, and and the glory and wonderful thing about when you first start is you have that kind of luxury. You can do that, and it's only once it starts becoming your living and you're bound by all those mechanics that you're not when you're first starting, that it becomes much harder to do that, and you have to kind of work out ways to sort of reclaim that MO, I think.
Without massaging your ego too much here, and I'm just wondering how do you think the reason that you're as you put it, like, you're very consistently employed, you have lots of you have opportunities coming your way that you want to work on and excite you, and you're a known script editor and writer within the industry, do you think the reason for that, I'm trying to think of a way of phrasing this which doesn't come off as probably insulting as it will do.
Just say it. You can always edit it out.
Yeah, no, but you'll know I've said it.
I don't mind.
I can add it in later if I was going to be insulting. No, my question was going to be, do you think like Graham Linehan, for example,
yes,
is a very famous writer?
Yes.
And I imagine he's got a base of people that just kind of see his name and kind of are going to immediately take to whatever he's done because of nostalgia of Father Ted or something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you not being necessarily as famously known, which is another thing we talked about, has helped you kind of get better notes, get better at taking rejection because it's not as public and it's kind of something that you can take time over, and you have sort of more ability to develop these skills kind of behind the scenes a bit more.
Maybe. I mean, the interesting thing when I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about it only today, one of the glories of that first starting out phase is the purity of it. Nobody knows you, and you've got no sort of expectations about what you're doing, and it is just you and the work. So, maybe there are advantages to that. People have less preconceptions about what it is that you do. It's hard for me to know really, because obviously I only know the water that I swim in. So it's hard really to be able to see it from outside of that position. I mean, because I suppose whatever profile I have, I was known as a collaborator. It was part of a something else, and indeed, the things I've done outside it that I'm known for have all been collaborations as well. Maybe that changes the way people that you work with relate to you. Possibly, maybe it makes you able to be more fluid. Maybe that's one of the reasons I enjoy collaborating, because I like being fluid. I like kind of putting on. I certainly hate being bored, and I hate the idea of repeating myself. So one of the things I have really enjoyed in my career is doing such different things and working with such different collaborators. So, maybe you pay a price in terms of, you could, like the career, that if I envied anyone's career, it would be Hitchcock's, because he was a brand, and not just a brand within the industry, but internationally. But, he worked bloody hard to make that the case, though. And that was from the get-go. But and I sort of think, that must be nice, because you're known for being brilliant at one thing. And I sort of seem to have been the opposite of that, in terms of having hopped from thing to thing in a sort of mercurial way. And yet, that's just how it's unfolded. And it's true that a lot of it seems to be a choice. But it's, we are not transparent to ourselves. It's all quite mysterious. That's why when we were talking before, the thing I'm grateful for is that it works. I'm able to do it and earn a good living at it. So that seems to be the most important thing.
Yeah. I had one question I wanted to ask you based on your email.
Yeah.
I specifically didn't email it to you, even though I now am slightly regretting not doing that, because I don't know whether you'd have to think about the answer. But in the email you were talking about the value of failing and obviously trying to grow from the failure rather than letting it defeat you.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you could think of an example of something that went through quickly that you look back on that you would have now liked to not have failed but had more barriers so that you think now, actually I could have put more work into that, or I could have changed that, or I would have invested more time in how the mechanics of that work?
There's loads of things that have been in development where various stages of the process have had to go too quickly for my liking, and I haven't been able to put in the thinking time, and then it's not been a surprise to me when those things haven't been greenlit. But the nice thing about that is that those things are all still there, or pretty much all of them are, apart from the odd one or two where it's someone else's IP. So they haven't gone away, and that you have the opportunity to go back and do that. In terms of things that have been made, the only thing that I can say that of is a play I did after Ghost Stories, which was an adaptation of Roald Dahl adult short stories, which I did for the Lyric the year after. And that was frustrating because we had a very compressed timescale to do it in. And then it was weirdly opened completely the wrong way around, where normally you would open something and preview it out of town and then bring it in. And then because of the vagaries of the Lyric's schedule, insanely, the opposite was the case. It was opened at the Lyric. And so it had its press night, without any... We had a preview week, but we didn't have weeks to run it in. And as a new play, that was really tough. And so, frustratingly, by the time the thing had finished its run, which it did in Newcastle, it was a much better show than it was when it opened in London. But which is not the normal way of these things. And so that was frustrating. That's about the only thing I think of things that have been, gone into production where I would like to have been able to go back and have much more time to do it. Because sometimes things can go quickly and it works to their favour, like the League specials, in 2017, they happened very quickly and it didn't harm them at all. Psychobich's first series happened very quickly, and that was a good thing. So it's not Oceans of Time is not automatically a good thing. Sometimes having to act quickly can be to something's benefit. But generally speaking, I think the thing about that Ghost Stories tale, of how the failure made it better, it wasn't just that it was a staggered process and there was time, it was that you had that emotional motivation to do that extra work, because you could have had lots of time and not had the failure and you wouldn't have done that extra work.
And I suppose at the time as well, given that, and I might be wrong, but you didn't have other projects on the go. It was kind of the thing that you were trying to get.
Yeah, you were pretty much putting everything into getting it going. Yeah, so that's you were really feeling it. Yeah.
So in some ways, you couldn't. No, you couldn't. But you couldn't let it go because what work were you going to find quickly that would start to pay for itself, as it were?
Yeah, I think I was doing. I was doing Tracy Ullman at the time. There were other things threaded through it because it wasn't bringing any money, so there had to be. Literally, it didn't bring. I mean, that's the other thing when you're developing a film. There's very little money up front. We had a bit of script money, but that was all. There was no money for the, for that shooting the taster tape or anything. So it was all unpaid. So, but yes, I never, time-wise, I wasn't able to take on a big other script because it was demanding too much, in order to do it well, of our undivided attention, which is one of the conundrums of when you're in movies. Yeah, I think is how you finance it.
And correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing from this is, each time you've done a project, so like a TV project or a script project, you've realised that A, failure is a good thing, or can be, and B, not all the time obviously, and B, each time you've done one, you've learnt more about how much time to invest, like not just in the script, as in looking externally to it, as in the mechanics of it and how it works. And by the virtue of the fact that it was your first feature film, you were learning those things again, like you did with TV, because it was a whole different industry. Would that be?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, and in fact, there was loads I didn't learn until after we'd finished. It was like because the finishing process was so extended. just, because it gets so finicky in the very final stages when you're ironing out all the technical difficulties, and it's your responsibility to do it. Just things like the DCP getting made, the thing that they project it off in the cinemas. That took weeks because there was kept being some tiny little thing wrong with it, and each time you had to go back and then review it. They had to remake it, and all of it meant I couldn't really start another new project. And then I realised, oh God, well, it gobbles up money, and you realise that there's not, that what you got paid for doing the film doesn't actually quite cover the time that it takes to finish the thing off, and I hadn't realised that, and so I now know, please God, we do another one, that you need to be well capitalised going in. And I don't know if I mentioned this last. I did see a brilliant interview with the Caine brothers which they don't often do. It was online somewhere, and they were saying, not even really fully joking, that their filmmaking career was a lost leader for their scriptwriting business, and because the films don't make money. Not in any real sense because of the way they do them. Everyone's doing things for scale, and they're not mega budget films. Obviously, they have occasional big box office successes that must contribute. But they were being serious, and they were saying, the way it works is that they have this other life as script doctors and writers for hire, writing things for the studio, most of which never gets made. When they'll come in and rewrite a project off from page one, and for which they're very well paid, and that enables them to make the films in the way that they want to make the film. And you would never think that. You would never think that in a million years that's how they do it. But of course, why not? They're not Superman. And it was really interesting and refreshing to hear that interview, and to sort of, it's a bit like doing this. That's the value of doing these things, of sharing this arcane knowledge. Everyone needs to share this information because nobody talks about that. How on earth do you make it pay?
No, I don't know if you listen to it. I mean, I often get compared to the Comedian's Comedian podcast.
Yeah.
Actually, you've done that. Yeah, you have done that, because I listened to that one again before I did your interview, and I often get compared to that one. Except I remembered when I was starting this one, Stu was starting that one, and we actually met because we were having a chat about podcasts in general, and I said to him, because I think he'd made like 5 episodes, and I said to him, I'm going to be doing what you do mixed with what, do you know Tim Ferriss? Yeah. I'm going to be doing somewhere in between the two of you, which is essentially discussing how the thing got made and how you can get the thing made, and the sort of nitty gritty of it. And I said to him, are you going to be asking those questions? Because I don't want to make a thing that you're already making. And he went, doesn't interest me. I'm not going to do it and stuff. So that means a lot that you, this has kind of been fun for you. And I tell you something, when we're talking about time, something that I had to remind someone the other day, they were looking at making a podcast. They said to me, I've got a deadline. I'm going to have the first episode out on the 1st of Feb. And what I had to remind them was, you've never made an episode before. You don't know what goes into it. It's good to have a deadline, but if you miss that deadline, you've got to remember that the first time you've done something, you shouldn't beat yourself up if you don't know how long it takes to do the thing. Do you know what I mean? Because it's all new to you. It's like, I get the deadline as a nice sort of placeholder, but it's hard to beat yourself up for not knowing a skill that no one's telling you how to do.
Absolutely, yeah. And to me, script writing in particular is all that. Because each time you do something, you discover another thing that you don't know. And I love, there's a quote from Picasso, which I love, where he says that he does things he doesn't know how to do, because that's how he learns how to do them. And and that's why he did all that, that breadth of stuff, of ceramics and and sculpture and as well as painting and drawing. And he was always trying to, and that's, I suppose that's another thing of my Quicksilver thing, of always trying to do different things. There's something in me that is restless, that likes that thing of keeping it new.
Cool.
So shall I tell the Charlie Higston story as well?
Yes, please. I was going to ask, I've got your email open, I was like, when's he going to...
So this was the other thing that occurred to me that was a really good thing, and it sort of felt it was important to share, was, so very early on when me and Mark had first written that first script together, just after we'd written it, or got a completed draft. So this was probably 1993, I guess, or maybe 92. And I was working part-time at Waterstones in Leeds, and we had lots of book events. It's one of the things I loved about doing that job, is got to meet many of my favourite authors. And Charlie Higson came, and at that time, he'd written quite a few novels. I think he was on his second or third novel, and those novels were, it was before he started doing the YA stuff that he does now. It was these were sort of psychological thrillers. But I also knew him because he wrote for Harry Enfield. I knew his name from Harry Enfield's TV series, and so knew that. And this was pre-Fast Show, so I I thought, well, I'm gonna dare to take that script that me and Mark have written and go to the event and dare to speak to him afterwards and see if he'll read this script. I'm unlike many people I know, like Andy and Mark, who are more natural networkers. I'm not. I feel I get very self-conscious and shy and awkward, and so it doesn't come easily to me, that sort of thing. But I sort of screwed my courage to the mast and made myself do it, because it was important, and I knew it was an opportunity. And so shaking went up to him at the end of the event, and said how much I liked what he did, and that would you read the script that I'd written. And he was very generous and very kind, and I said absolutely. And I gave it to him, and that in itself was exhilarating, that he'd just taken it. But then he got back. He got back in touch. He wrote a really wonderful letter, which came back quite quickly, a week or two later, and said how much he genuinely loved the script. Said all the things he liked about it. Said that we could write, and we could write funny. I could remember that sentence. I still carry that around with me now. And then asked us if he would. He was putting this show together with Paul Whitehouse. This sketch show, which is what obviously went on to become the Fast Show, and would we like to submit some material? So we sat down and wrote a load of sketches, and I've yet to hear from him. But despite the fact that I've worked with him since, never mentioned those sketches again. But of course he came. He was brilliant, Charlie. He came a lot to the. He didn't bite on any of those sketches, and his way of dealing with it was just not to ever mention it. But he did come and see the League in that very first run at the Canal Cafe, and he was someone who was around in those early days and was very encouraging. And then me and Mark did an episode of Randall and Hopkirk for him, and he's somebody who I've had regular contact with over the years. And but that initial meeting, that was that. I realise now it was really important, because it was I think that was the first affirmation with the comedy, having someone you respected in the industry, say you can write funny. And I think that was fuel for about 5 years. Every time, every rejection that would have had after that, it was like I would probably get the letter out from Charlie and read it. And just remind myself. And so those things are so important. And so I think, so there's two things in it. I think when you're when you're at that starting out point, being, if you're like me and not a natural networker, be courageous, because so much can come from it, in terms of you don't know what can happen. And even just a positive response is enormously valuable, even if it's nothing more than that. So it's really worth being brave and being courageous always, and sort of daring to put your head above the parapet. And then I think the flip of it is, if you're in Charlie's position, being generous, because it does so much. And a simple gesture, it was just the fact that he took half an hour or an hour to read the script, and and another half an hour to write the letter and post it. It was of incalculable value to me and Mark. And so, don't underestimate how important that might be if someone sticks a script in your hand. Which doesn't mean you have to lie to someone, because I don't think there's particularly value in that. sometimes it is better to let things go quietly. But if you see the value, I think then to communicate it is, just that act alone is hugely important.
That's lovely. Sorry.
No.
Yeah. A lot of the repeat messages on this podcast are having someone that believes in you, or at least someone who has said something that lets you know you can have belief in yourself.
Yes, exactly that.
Yeah, and I think because we're all insular in this industry a lot of the time, even when you're collaborating, like you say, you're up in Yorkshire, you might do work up there, you come down, but there's, a lot of the time you do spend on your own, even if you are collaborating, and like you might go away and write a script and then come back and then you work together, but there's always going to be moments where you need to know that somebody likes what you do, but it doesn't mask it as an ego thing. It masks it as a constructive thing.
That's right. It wasn't an ego trip. It was confirmation that you weren't insane.
I tell you what, I'm going to leave that there. But thank you so much for coming back on.
No, that's it. And thank you, Sam. Thanks for letting me add those things.
No worries. That was Jeremy. Hearing about the power of negative thoughts and your attitude when you get kickbacks is so important. I loved it. The cost of creating films and how to get the courage to ask for help when he wanted feedback on his early scripts. All of these things are just so important. I think they're so important that big people and people that have established themselves still talk about and still pass on down to people, because I think often I look at people and I go, well, they're just doing it effortlessly. They're doing it without any help, and it's easy for them. And I don't think it is. And I think it's important that we all realise and recognise that asking for help and taking help and having a positive attitude when it's negative is just important. It's just so important. So thank you. I can't thank him enough. His Twitter handle is in the show notes, so please do send him a thank you, because it was amazing that he would take the time to do 2 pods essentially. I was over the moon with this. Speaking of help, Edinburgh Fringe, I'm doing it. It's 4th solo show. It is at 8:35 p.m. It is in the Grass Market. It is called Every Room Becomes a Panic Room When You Overthink Enough. It is my favourite show I've ever done, but that it always should be. Please come. It's £5 a ticket. I'd really appreciate any support you could give. If you can't come, if you could just pass on the message, if you could share a link, if you could do anything, tweet at me so that I can thank you personally. I'll be keeping an eye on that link anyway, and I've got alerts set up for things so I can thank everyone. It's not as narcissistic as it sounds. I want to make sure that everyone gets a thank you that supports me and puts stuff out that helps me. So anything and everything would really, really be appreciated. If you like this episode, you might also like the episode with Phil Jupitus about the Edinburgh Fringe, about the Free Fringe, about the paid Fringe, and about life beyond Never Mind the Buzzcocks. Or you might enjoy the episode with Doug Stanhope about how he shunned the industry in many ways and built his own audience email by email onto his mailing list. Highly recommend both those episodes. I massively enjoyed both. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can do it in several ways. You can leave a review. Here is we've got a couple of new reviews. I'm really happy that they're coming in. Please do keep them coming in. I've got a review from someone who's called themselves ATIP, which is great because I know that they are an old school listener now, because early on I was calling the pod ATI, which unless they are just lazy with their screen name. Either way works. So I don't know who they are because I can't work it out from this, but ATIP, 5 stars. Just listen to the Armando Minucci episode. Very entertaining and informative. Interesting to hear how things have changed in the world of commissioning new comedy. These podcasts are a truly fabulous resource for the UK comedy industry. Thank you, ATIP. I massively appreciate your time. Fiona Coffee Time, which is a bloody banging screen name. I've met Fiona. That is awesome. Well played, you. Fiona Coffee Time has given this 5 stars. She's called it a treasure trove of ideas and inspiration. Not usually a big consumer of podcasts, but if you want to make your mark without wasting heaps of time and money, you'd be daft not to listen to what the experts have to say. Simon is an engaging interviewer, thank you very much, who lets subjects do the talking. Thank you very much. That's a really lovely review. Please do keep those reviews coming in. They help with the charts. They help with making the podcast look better and more exciting to bigger and better guests as we go forward. As you can tell, I'm really pushing forward and trying to get bigger and better guests on, and that only happens if you guys support it. You can also join the podcast group called RC Industry Podcast on Facebook. That is the best place to ask your questions to upcoming guests to get your answers from them directly. Please join that. That'd be amazing. Also, you can donate. You can become a patron from $1 an episode. Is this worth 80p? I think it's worth a lot more, but if you could only give 80p or $1 in this case, please do that. Everything is massively appreciated. So that, or you can give a one-off donation via PayPal on my website. There are links in the show notes to everything. All support is massively appreciated. Financial, time, shares, everything. Just please keep that going. The Ask the Industry podcast is a Fruit That Got in Gravity's Way production for the internet. All elements were created by me, comedian Simon Caine. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for subscribing. And thank you very much for rating and donating if you do. I will see you all in about 14 days' time. Bye!